Of Confinement for Young People, which, in my opinion, is required reading for anyone interested in issues of juvenile justice or lack thereof. Alexandra Cox is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Essex. She is a former Gates Cambridge Scholar and Soros Justice Advocacy Fellow. She previously worked at the Drug Policy Alliance and the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexandra Cox.
Thank you so much, David, for that really kind introduction, and I'm so grateful for you for engaging with the book as well, which is really nice. It's always nice to talk to readers and people who kind of thought through the issues. And thank you so much to the staff at Eastern State. I'm really grateful to be here and grateful to all of you for being here in this wretched heat. So thank you for, hopefully I'll be as succinct as possible so that we can have some time for conversation. So, my route into this book began about 15 years ago when I was working in New York City and I was representing teenagers charged as adults. In New York State, teenagers as young as 13 can be charged as adults and face lengthy terms of incarceration up to life in prison. And for so many of the teenagers that I represented, I would go visit them in jail, sometimes at Rikers Island, sometimes in the juvenile detention facilities, and talk to them about their life histories, but also their futures and their future possibilities. And my job, in large part, was to advocate for them to not go to prison. But of course, we didn't always win that battle. And so many of the young people that I represented were sentenced to time in facilities many hours away from New York City. And I never had a chance to see them after they went away. And when I left my job in New York City to go get my PhD, I became intrigued by the real lack of information about juvenile incarceration. The inability of so many people to go inside. It was so easy for my clients to be sentenced to these facilities, but so hard for so many people, like researchers and journalists, to get access to the inside of juvenile prisons. And so I applied for and gained access to study New York State's juvenile justice system, and I studied about 6 prisons and spent time in and outside of those prisons. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about my journey through those prisons, but also to give you a little bit of historical context about juvenile incarceration. Because in many ways, actually, this site is so important for thinking about the history of why we actually treat certain kinds of young people differently than others. Eastern State housed a number of young people over the course of its history. In fact, there were 800 children who were incarcerated here over the course of history, and the penitentiary has put together a really nice little sort of portfolio of information about the history of children here. And children were incarcerated here even after the founding of the New York State, the Philadelphia House of Refuge, which was an institution that was founded in 1826 with the sole intention of incarcerating children separately from adults. And this was done by a group of reformers who were inspired by movements in Europe and abroad, and was founded just 1 year after the first House of Refuge for Children, which was in New York State in 1825. And what I want to focus on in the context of this talk is what really first struck me when I first began doing research in New York State, when I set foot on the grounds of what was formerly the State Industrial School, which was founded in 1904 in a rural park outside of Rochester, New York. And I went there to study a facility which was called Industry at the time, and it was a facility where young people who were sentenced and charged as adults were sent and were incarcerated. But it lay on the grounds of the former State Industrial School, which was founded in the sort of at the height of a movement to separate children from adults and to incarcerate children in a kind of program of work and industry with the aim of reforming them. And one of the things that I was struck by as I entered the grounds of the State Industrial School was the fact that the very buildings that were established in the early part of the 20th century were still intact, and in fact still housed the children that were incarcerated there in the late 2000s when I first went there. And it was that experience that really caused me to kind of look back in order to look forward. And I began to think about the image of what is a palimpsest, which is something that's reused or altered but still bears visible traces of its earlier form. That's something that's reused or altered but still bears traces of its original form. And in so many cases, the reform schools and the institutions that were founded for young people are now reused as prisons for young people. And I wanted to think about the ways that the past has resonance for the present. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the ways that this historical context can help us understand the ways that we punish young people today. And also some of the key kind of contemporary issues in juvenile justice reform that are really critical for helping us to think about what we can do today. And thinking about juvenile residential facilities, which is what they're called today, as a lens through which we can kind of begin to understand why and how youth incarceration is so very complicated. The first houses of refuge were founded in part through this theory that prisons were kind of schools of crime for young people, that if young people were exposed to adults who committed crimes, they would in fact learn how to commit crimes in an even greater way. But these institutions, these houses of refuge, were only reserved for a few. That was exclusively for white children. So young children of color were sent to prisons like this one. Children who were deemed to not be appropriate for the care of the house of refuge were sent to prisons. And in fact, in 1886, the average number of children incarcerated in the 2 houses of refuge in Philadelphia was just over 1,000 children. And that year, collectively, 576 children were committed to the 2 institutions, but almost that same number of young people were sent to adult prisons. And it wasn't until a number of years later that a separate house of refuge was created for Black children. So it was almost 29 years later that the separate house of refuge was created for Black children. And so during that period of time, Black children were sentenced to prisons and continued to be sent to the prisons afterwards. And it was only the children who were deemed to be appropriate subjects for reform who were sent to these houses of refuge. And what I want you to sort of think about as I continue to talk about the work of juvenile incarceration today is how that idea about who's appropriate for treatment and reform continues to resonate in the way that we think about juvenile justice and juvenile incarceration today. Pennsylvania is a really interesting state for thinking about the ways that we incarcerate children. So in many ways, it's one of the harshest states in the country for incarcerating children. So not only does the state have this history of sentencing children to places like the Eastern State and sending them to harsh terms of imprisonment, it also in the 1990s was part of a broader nationwide trend to amplify penalties for young people. And in 1995, created an act which created a mandatory transfer provision for children charged with certain violent felonies. And those children we mandatorily and are mandatorily sentenced to adult prison. It also allows for a discretionary waiver system for kids aged 14 and older to be transferred to the adult system. And up until recently, Pennsylvania led the country in the number of young people who were sentenced to life without parole. And the Supreme Court recently eliminated the requirement for life without parole for teenagers, and a number of young people have been going through resentencing hearings and have gone through those hearings in Pennsylvania. But there are still huge numbers of young people, or people who were sentenced as young people, to life without parole, who still remain in Pennsylvania's prisons. What I want to talk about today, though, are the children who are in many ways on the flip side of that kind of story of harsh punishment. So in many ways, we talk about life without parole and adult prisons for children as kind of the harshest excesses of punishment. So I live in England now, and we don't sentence children aged 14 to life without parole. It's considered to be a sort of abhorrent practice. But one of the things that I want to talk about is what happens to the children who remain in the juvenile justice system, and what do those conditions of confinement look like? In many ways, I'm not a Pennsylvania resident, but the story of places like Eastern, but also Greaterford, have become household names. But the names of juvenile facilities may be less well known amongst even some of you. And those juvenile facilities are places which still continue to be under scrutinized and continue to be located in places many hours away from children's home. And in fact, I just talked to a lawyer for children in Pennsylvania today who was driving 6 hours to go visit one of her clients who's from Philadelphia. Pennsylvania itself has 2 forestry camps for children and 3 residential treatment facilities. And so again, when we begin to think about incarceration in Pennsylvania, what does incarceration look like? I'm going to talk today about several themes that have become really important in thinking about youth incarceration. And those themes relate to the early history of the establishment of institutions like the House of Refuge and the kinds of theories that animated the establishment of those institutions. I also want to talk about the ways that juvenile facilities or residential juvenile facilities really raise perplexing questions about custody and care and control and what incarceration looks like. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the ways that young people's lives outside of the facilities, outside of the prisons, impact on their time inside. And what can we do? When I first moved to New York, I realized that New York was actually the site of so many of the kind of early ideas about what child saving should look like. And it was in fact the work of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children and ideas about removal of children from their homes and families to largely rural areas, which really have continued to animate incarceration today. So the very idea that this lawyer for children is driving 6 hours to go and visit her client at a juvenile facility has a history. The idea that children can be reformed and saved by being sent and removed far away from their homes originated with the progressive era in the late 19th century with reformers who tried to liberate largely white immigrant children or other people's children from their homes and families because they felt that those children were living in conditions that they called criminogenic or crime-causing. And that effort at saving children, I would argue, still is really important to interrogate today, because largely today, in New York State, 80% of children in the juvenile facilities are children of color, and ideas about saving those children are incredibly important to think critically about. My project was based on some time that I spent inside of New York's juvenile facilities, as I talked about. So I spent time doing immersive, qualitative research in residential juvenile facilities or prisons across New York State over the course of about 3 years. My first project was focused on a group of young people who went through prison, and then the second project was about a group of staff members inside of those prisons. And then I also spent time in the New York State archives trying to examine and understand the history of reform in New York State. And I was sometimes shocked and astounded and surprised by the real resonance and the familiarity of the language from 1860 to 1930 to 1960 of reformers and child savers about what is right for children and how we should treat kids. And I actually entered the New York State system at a time of so-called reform when the state was really trying to close a lot of facilities. And that became really important for me to try to understand what happened inside. So when we think about what a juvenile facility is, we often, when I first entered New York State and I wrote my proposal, the state discouraged me from using the word prison anywhere in my proposal. And they were concerned that my use of the word prison was inaccurate. They said, these are juvenile facilities that you're studying. These are not prisons. This is an image of a juvenile facility in Pennsylvania. This is an image of a juvenile facility that I spent a great deal of time in New York. Now, for many, this looks like a prison, I think. It has the same hurricane wire fencing. You have to go through the same kind of gates. In some ways, not dissimilar to what we a version of what we came through today. And in many ways, when we talk about reform, is making these facilities look kinder and nicer for children. So another facility I went to looked like this. It didn't have wire around it. It didn't have hurricane fences. It didn't have great locks and keys. Well, what I want to suggest during this talk is that it's equally important to scrutinize these facilities as it is this facility, because all of these facilities are trying to engage in a program of care and control and growth and change, but they are using punishment as the vehicle for doing that. So young people are sentenced to incarceration, to a term of incarceration in these facilities, which they can't leave. They are denied their freedom when they're sent to these facilities. And these facilities are most crucially also schools, because children who get sent to these facilities are also still legally obliged to be in full-time education. It's something that we often forget. But there's schools which present really perplexing ideas and dynamics about care and control, again, because there's schools which are guarded by officers who work in the facilities, and those officers in the facilities that I worked in sat in on the school programs, and often alarms and restraints and all other kinds of interruptions happen throughout the school day. In New York State, just to give you a little bit of context, the young people who go to these facilities kind of range, and what I want to highlight here is what that range of interventions looks like. So one group of young people who goes there in New York State are young people charged as adults, and they will do the first part of their sentence there, and if they turn 21 while their sentence is still happening, they'll get sent to an adult prison. But more importantly, I want to highlight what the experience is for young people who are adjudicated as delinquents, because this is really a crucial and important distinction. Now, the reason why I say adjudicated as delinquent is that that is the language that was established to differentiate a child from an adult. So adjudication is not officially a criminal procedure. And a young person is said to have, they don't come out of this procedure with a record, they don't have, they're expected to have an experience which is treatment-oriented, and it's supposed to be a different experience than that of an adult. But one thing that's really important to note is that their placement can be indeterminate and can be extended at the will of the state. And for many of the young people who were inside, they were facing often very lengthy terms of incarceration. And in fact, while I worked at the public defender's office, I had a client who I saw on Rikers Island who was sentenced to 3 months in custody for a crack cocaine sales charge. And that was when he was 17. And when he was 13, he was sentenced to 3 years in custody for the very same charge. When he was adjudicated as a delinquent, the state sentenced him to an indeterminate placement. And you see the state can extend that placement at any point in time based on his behavior in custody. Now, this is not to suggest that the adult system is preferable or better for kids, but it's just to explain that this system of indeterminate placements is really crucial to understand when you think about young people and care and this program of control I'll talk to you about. So when a young person enters a facility in New York State, at the time that I went in there, they were given a set of shoelaces. It was a white pair of shoelaces and a pair of sneakers. And that pair of shoelaces indicated that they were on what's called the orientation level of behavioral change. Now, this is part of what you call a token economy. And token economies are used in juvenile facilities across the country, and juvenile detention facilities and placement facilities. It's an incentives and earned privileges system. So a young person can climb up through a stage of change, with green being the highest stage of change. So the green level or green shoelaces is the highest stage that you can get to while you're in the facility. And associated with that stage of change are certain privileges. So if I have green shoelaces, I can call home for longer. I can get more money in commissary. I can spend a little bit more time out of my cell. If I'm on the white shoelaces, my movements are very restricted. I have an inability to call home. I can only call home, I think, once a week, usually. And they're really severely restricted privileges. And as you'll see, there's certain kinds of behavioral expectations associated with each stage. And those expectations are deeply connected to ideas about deference, self-control, responsibility, and self-change. Ironically, when I began to do some of the historical research, I learned that in the New York State Training Institute for Girls, which was established in the late 19th century, girls wore different colored ribbons in their hair to denote the stage of change that they were on. So this is not a system that is actually in any way new. I mean, in New York State now, they don't use shoelaces anymore, but they still rely upon a token economy for young people to advance through a stage system. The stage system emphasizes self-mastery and discipline, deference, responsibility, and self-control as the markers of success. As part of this system, young people are expected to open, and I'll read this out to you, this is a little bit hard to read. This is a progress report that staff are expected to fill in. They're expected to follow rules of the facility and obey staff direction. They're expected to avoid peers who engage in antisocial behaviors. They're not allowed to talk to each other at meals, so they all, in this case, you'll see they're facing one direction. One of the young people that I met talked about the experience of going home and eating at his dining room table and eating in 5 minutes and not talking to his family members because he becomes so institutionalized around the meal prohibition on speaking. And all of this may begin to sound familiar to you. As you may remember, when I talked to you about the establishment of the houses of refuge, I talked about how those houses were established with the philosophy that young people, these places were schools of crime, that they'd be exposed to other people who would teach them how to commit crime. This idea that young people will somehow, if they associate with each other, will become more sort of deviant, it's a philosophy that pervades life in the juvenile facility. And it's not necessarily one that really has strong founding in what we know about young people, which is that teenagers grow and develop through intimate relationships and friendships. But the prohibition on speaking to each other lasted both during and beyond their time in custody. They were not allowed to talk to each other once they were released, even though a number of them formed very strong friendships while they were inside. During the time that I was there, and the young people were also expected to hold their hands behind their backs as they walked through the facility. Now that policy was changed while I was in the facility, and to a great deal of resistance amongst the staff, because the staff perception was that this was a way that young people, that they could control the young people under their care, and that the young people would only be stopped from fighting if they did this. The staff also use a very high number of restraints in the facility. Juvenile facilities have a particularly high number of physical restraints, physical restraint levels. And the kind of restraint differs. In some cases, actually in a facility in Pennsylvania, the accusation has been that chemical restraints via psychotropic medications have been overused. In New York State, at the time I entered, a young person had died at the hands of staff after being physically restrained. But restraints become a common tool by staff to feel like they're under control, or keeping young people under control. One of the young people I met talked to me about this system of change and the expectations for change that were put upon him when he got there. And he said, he'd been spending some time in the facility, and yet he got into a lot of fights when he first entered the facility. He'd been sentenced to 3 to 9 years in custody. And when he first got in, he got into a lot of fights. He was charged with sex offense, and he knew that he would be a mandatory, be part of a registerable sex offense. And he knew that when he returned home to the place that he was going to, he would effectively be barred from living with his family, because his family lived within 1,000 feet of the school zone. And when he first entered the program, he didn't comply. He struggled to move up through the shoelace stage. But then he said he observed another resident who was moving up through the stages and was doing pretty well. He called him a Mr. Robot. He said he decided that he was going to be a Mr. Robot, just like that resident. He was going to do everything perfectly. He was going to mimic that Mr. Robot. And I asked him, what did that other kid do? And he said he did perfect program. So a lot of young people talked about doing program. And doing program was really about complying with the rules of the facility. So he started doing what he did, and they left me alone. I asked him what were some of the examples of what he did. He said, raise his hand, for not necessary things, raising his hand. He'd ask the teachers for a pencil, and he'd be incredibly deferential. He'd sort of try to comply with every ask that the teachers made. What struck me about what News said, and what so many of the other young people talked about, which they talked about faking it to make it. And fake it to make it is such an interesting expression, because it in many ways, it suggests, in Alcoholics Anonymous terms, it suggests in some ways a necessary kind of performance, a way to kind of become sober in some ways. For the young people in the facility, fake it to make it was about perfecting the art of performing deference and self-mastery so that they could get out of the facility, so that they could gain more benefits in care. And as I mentioned to you, for young people facing indeterminate sentences, this was a way to freedom. It was a pathway to freedom. One of the questions that I began to think a lot about and has been written about in the context of juvenile correctional facilities is this aim, this dual aim at sort of reforming children and trying to care for children, but also controlling them, and the tensions that exist. This is not to say that there weren't actually efforts at care that were made within the facilities. A number of staff built very complicated and sometimes very beautiful relationships with young people that were that reflected their deep investment in them. And in many ways, the state itself attempted on the surface to care for young people. But in many ways, I want to question what this form of care looks like. In many states, including New York, the state agencies are making an effort to make systems seemingly more caring. So New York State and others, and Virginia, have been trying to introduce what they're calling a trauma-informed care system. And what they're calling a trauma-informed care system is one which often has better lighting, more open interior spaces, it says here, light colors. In New York State, the state agency allowed young people to paint their rooms, the color that they chose, and have comforters on their beds. And this was an effort to kind of make the system more caring. But what I began to realize as I spent more time in the facilities, in a particular facility where girls were allowed to paint their rooms, was that the children were no less despairing, they were no less angry, there were no less, it was no less repressive a place. But even as it began to change in some ways in appearance, the experience of behavioral control still existed. And this is what some people have termed carceral humanism. In an effort to humanize facilities and make them kinder and more gentler, without accepting that these are underlying systems of control and incarceration, we question whether the underlying system of control is actually being undermined. I think that the other core component of this challenge to this system of more caring prisons also is one which, in many ways in New York State, what I observed was a complete denial of what was happening outside of the systems. So Joe Phoenix, who's a colleague of mine, I think writes very beautifully about the ways that young people are punished for actions when many of those actions that they engage in are actually shaped by conditions over which they have no control. Both in the legal sense, but also the developmental sense. So for so many of the young people that I met, even though they were adjudicated as delinquents and did not necessarily have a criminal conviction on their records, they faced enormous challenges to getting housing on the outside, for example. They may be 18 when they leave custody and be placed into a homeless shelter, or go back to a public housing apartment where they're actually denied from going there because they sold drugs on the property of the housing facility. They face extreme distress and unease and uncertainty in child welfare systems because many of them are aging out of foster care systems where they have nowhere to go when they're leaving. And they also face deep uncertainty about what family is and where family is going to be. Their parents, they may have been removed from their mother, and their mother is only in an apartment for one person, not two. They're deep and persistent problems and questions that are raised about medical care. And I brought this up in part because my friends who are in the audience are both ER doctors, and I've thought a little bit as I've talked to them about what the public health implications of incarceration are. And I think for children, there's some really, really important questions about how children can exercise autonomy over their medical health care decisions when they're sentenced to prisons. I had a client who had diabetes, and she was non-compliant with her treatment regimen. And the judge sentenced her to prison because it was his perception that that term of incarceration would make her compliant with her diabetes regime. Deep issues about access to mental health care. In New York State, a number of children with criminal convictions are routinely denied from residential mental health care services because of their convictions. Access to employment, even with a juvenile delinquency adjudication, is very difficult because young people are coming out of juvenile facilities where they're still marked by that record. Education is enormously complex for young people who may have received some high school credits while they're in a juvenile facility, but those credits are not accepted in the outside world. So one of the teenagers that I met with on the inside had actually graduated from high school while she was inside. And she went back to her home community, and she was really excited to walk because she was getting out in the springtime. And her home high school wouldn't accept the credits. And then finally, the kind of indeterminacy of the interventions in young people's lives, all of these kinds of broader social systems, and also processes of criminalization, because these are young people who have deep, deep relationships with law enforcement. One of the young people in the book I knew had been stopped by the police 15 times in 1 month. These barriers are ignored for the most part in the context of the treatment programs in the facility, and in many ways are deemed to be really the problem of other systems of care. And in this case, this is what I think some people have called a kind of form of repressive welfareism. So in many ways, the state is seen as a vehicle for solving social problems which originate outside of the facilities, and their offending is explained as a sort of product of all of these other social systems. And the kind of repressive state is used as a way to kind of address and solve these systems, yet fails, fails, and fails again. Which is why I use the image of the vice for the title of my book. A vice pushes as much as it pulls. It seeks to stimulate growth in young people and change. So the purpose of the system is to change young people, but it also does a great deal to prevent them from growing up. And I think that this is a real challenge when we begin to think about what we do. So what I want to think about, just to end, it's very hot in here, is to think about kind of some of the things that we can do as we think about this, like, often very despairing story. I think one of the reasons why I talked about that image of the palimpsest, and again, the palimpsest is, it's really a way of thinking about the ways that something can be reused or altered, but still bears the traces of its original form. The juvenile justice system first began really in Philadelphia and New York and the United States in the middle of the 19th century. And in many ways, we've been kind of reproducing the same system over and over and over again. And I think that this kind of way of treating people, which has been largely oriented around discipline and self-mastery and punishment, and in ways that are deeply racialized and have real resonances of historical processes of racial subjugation, are important to think about very critically. So I think that, I think it's incredibly important to think about the past in order to move forward. And in some ways, it's really important to be here too, where so many young people were sent as adults, and in fact to think about what children were seen to be less deserving who were sent here. I also think we have this impulse to do all the time, and one of the kind of real problems of the history of juvenile justice has been the constant desire to do and reform and change in ways that we call not sort of in a way that actually reproduces the same structures that exist. So when I talk about the Virginia juvenile justice system that is trying to add new lighting and make the facilities look nicer, what I want to begin to question is whether in fact that fundamentally alters the structure of punishment that we've subjected young people to for so many years and we know has failed. And what I want to argue for is a kind of what some people call non-reformist reform, which is trying to imagine what's possible in terms of human needs and demands, not what is possible within a given system. So what we try to do now is say, we have these existing structures of punishment, and what can we do to make them better? But I want us to begin to imagine what we can begin to do in terms of thinking about what human needs and demands exist at the heart of the system and how we can begin to change that. So, thank you.
If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Cox, we can do that.
Go to you first.
So I would touch briefly on the barriers that juveniles face medical. I was wondering if you could talk about what you observe in psychiatric settings and that health
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, I think so the question was, I talked about the barriers to healthcare, and I'll include mental health care in that as well, in the facilities on the outside of the facilities, but it was a great question about what happens inside of the facilities. I think two things. One is I'll start with mental health care. So when I first arrived in the system, there was only one psychiatrist in the entire state. And as you all hopefully know, New York State is an enormous state. It takes 9 hours to drive from Buffalo to New York City. That changed, but it didn't change substantially. And then when I entered the facilities I worked in, usually I had a single mental health unit or a kind of mental health roving treatment program and program of psychotropic medication. Now, one of the dangers of the mental health programs in the facilities was that some judges viewed the sentencing, as I kind of suggested, as a form of treatment for young people. So I think this is like one of the real dangers of paternalism, is that we think that young people should receive, the only way they can receive help is by being sentenced to a juvenile facility. And the provision of care, there's some really decent clinicians in there. They were, by the time I left, the State Department of Mental Health and Hygiene had clinicians in the facilities. But in many ways, what they struggled with, and actually I was reminded of this last night when I gave a talk in upstate New York and some of the clinicians were there, is that when I talked about that system of behavioral control earlier, they have to function within that system. So they're trying to provide mental health treatment and interventions in the context of a very, very heavy system of behavioral control, which can feel incredibly maddening for some young people. And young people are routinely being punished for resistance to that system of change, and yet the clinicians are trying to recognize that their resistance to the system is a symptom of other, issues. Mental care is really interesting. So, I mean, there are infirmaries in the facilities, and then there are usually nurses who are hired from external agencies who come and work in the facilities. But actually, for me, the most interesting question, so in adult prisons, we're dealing with real public health issues like hepatitis C, HIV transmission. Those are less serious in juvenile facilities. But what's no less important is that you have a group of young people who have basically been like undertreated in the community. So as an example, I had a client who was 15 and he went to a juvenile detention facility, and his mother told us that he didn't know how to read. And it turned out he'd never been tested, had his eyes tested, and couldn't see. And so you have like a huge number of young people who may have been undertreated in the community and have enormous health needs, or young people with critical care needs. So there was a young person I worked with who had a very serious chronic heart condition, and it was so bad that he'd been hospitalized a lot. And he was sent to a facility that was, I think, 2 hours away from the nearest acute sort of medical facility. And negotiating what care could look like for him was really complicated because his mother, there's huge issues around consent if you're under 18. So what if he's having an emergency, like a heart attack, right? And the facility can't reach his mother. I mean, there's so many really, really challenging questions there. We don't deal with the same chronic issues, but there's sort of like external and internal issues. So I think I'm going to do next.
I think there's possibly another, but I often wonder, when I was growing up, there were many people sent to mental health institutions by the state, New Jersey, anywhere.
Yes.
And now there are few. But some of these people, young people and older people, are really walking around the prison. They have a mental health problem, which could be treated, but I suspect it doesn't happen. And you could probably speak to me about that.
Yeah, and I think so certainly, yes, and when I was working in New York City during, between 2004 and 2015, the number of residential beds for young people shrunk substantially. Residential mental health treatment beds, they shrunk substantially. But I just want to make one caveat, which is that, I learned this from a friend of mine who worked in the New York City. She represented people in hearings who were suffering from acute and persistent mental health disorders. And I think one risk or danger that we have is that we then say, well, more people should go to the mental health system. But the mental health system is also a hugely, damaging place in some ways for young people as well. Really, really high numbers of restraints, very under scrutinized, there's a lot of lack of oversight. And in many ways, like a win in a case might be to get someone placed in a mental health facility. But then the danger I found when I was doing the work is that I then forget in many ways that also the mental health facilities need to be scrutinized and examined themselves. And I think increasingly reformers are saying, well, our juvenile facilities are filled with young people with mental health problems, but juvenile facilities should not be used to solve mental health problems. So the idea is, so the reform strategy is expand mental health treatment in juvenile facilities rather than thinking more extensively about what mental health looks like on the outside.
You also mentioned about the issues with education and then not accepting credits. Could you speak a little bit more to that? Like, is it just because they're not following the same sort of curriculum, or is it like quality of education organic?
Yeah, it's a huge variety, and look, it's interesting because like in New York State passed a bill requiring that local jurisdictions accept credits when I was working there, and yet a lot of local jurisdictions continue not to. So they were the schools and the facilities occupied kind of a funny place because they weren't officially accredited schools, but they could administer. It's called something different now. It's called the task code, GEDs, basically. They couldn't give diplomas out. And I think there were two things going on. One is that in local communities there was a stigma, so it's just ignorance and kind of this idea, oh well, those credits aren't real, even if they did, look exactly, even if the kids went through a rigorous curriculum. So there's sort of just this idea that credits aren't real. But then also there is a murky zone for some of these facilities which don't, they don't give kids the justice of getting a diploma, which for so many people means something, right? Like to have a diploma in your hand is, it's a point of pride, and I think, and in many ways, for young people, felt more real than a GED. And so, and there were a lot of issues around oversight and accountability for the schools themselves that I think I really struggled with when I was inside. I sat in a lot of classrooms for many hours. I was so struck by how many alarms happened, how many interruptions, that just not taken seriously by the staff. Young people were there to learn. Another really striking thing that happened while I was in the facilities was that in one of the facilities I was in, it was for teenagers versus adults, and they were all divided by unit. And the units were they had different age groups, so you could be like a 14-year-old to an 18-year-old on a unit. And each unit did school together, so again, pure contagion. The theory was if you mix students together, they're going to fight. So they all stayed in the same unit. And there were a lot of kids who were in the facility for over 4 years. Do you know they recycled the same curriculum every year? And that was astonishing to me, And the kids recognized how horrible this was. But there was no vehicle, they critiqued, they were the people who pointed this out to me, by the way, it wasn't the teachers. And there was no vehicle for critique, critique was punished.
So basically, when they were released to back out, they ended up going back to a regular school to get those GEDs or diplomas.
Yeah.
They would keep that cycle all over again.
Yeah, and so they'll go back to, and the school doesn't necessarily take them, right? So they'll go back to a school, but the school sometimes and often says no. So they'll get pumped into an alternative school or a GED program, which happens a lot. And these are schools, remember, where a lot of these kids were hated, right? They were seen as the bad kids, and the teachers hated them and don't want to see them come back. So, for someone who's made huge educational progress while they're in a facility, it's incredibly discouraging to then go home to a school which then doesn't, take the credits which they receive.
So by the state putting them in that position, it is the state. What do you think the state will make it so that when they receive that stuff there, that they come home with it? And
right.
It is good because half of them are over 18 now.
Right.
And going back to school, they're looking for employment.
Right.
They ask for a high school diploma.
Yeah.
They have one basically.
Right.
It's not good.
Well, you're making making one of the main points of my book, which is that this is an abandonment by the state of the kids. You know, like this is a state agency which is fulfilling state credits and it's actually failing to deliver on what it's mandated to deliver, right? So in some ways, who's exercising child neglect here? Is it the state or is it the parent, right?
So I'm also curious about this idea of abandonment. What did you see as far as aftercare reentry planning in the institutions? Because, you know, you could imagine a scenario where either, you know, say you have an advocate who's working with them to get their credits transferred and get the mental health services in the community, and that might be something that's beneficial for their overall long-term, you know, well-being. But you could also imagine a scenario where this supervision gets replicated in the community, where, you know, they're leaving and now there's someone else who's actually doing things wrong and you're getting this back in the system. So what did that look like when New York City?
Yeah, I feel bad that it's such a despairing portrait. I'm trying to end with something. You know, in New York, I think the first thing I'll say is, remember, I started out by saying a lot of the kids that I used to represent got sent to facilities where I never saw them, you know. And so you have to remember, like, if a criminal defense, even the best criminal defense attorneys once their client is sentenced, aren't necessarily following through. I mean, some really do and do a great job with it, but some states have advocates. I was just in Delaware, the Delaware Public Defender's Office is trying to do that. But, you know, in New York State, the kid goes to the facility and there are two agencies that are responsible for reentry. One is parole, because if you're sentenced as an adult, you go on adult level parole, and the other is the state agency, the aftercare. And the way that the state views reentry is almost entirely separate from the time inside. Now, they'll say in their public messaging that they care about reentry, but really the reality is you're given a bus ticket and a ride home, and you're told to report to parole or aftercare. And parole, adult parole, is all about curfew monitoring, surveillance, and control. Aftercare is nominally better, but for the most part, you know, the kind of really complicated questions are much more difficult to answer. And in fact, what I was so struck by was that there was also a real lack of longitudinal sense of aftercare. So I was in a facility once, and there was a kid in his cell pacing back and forth really anxiously. And the line staff who are, by the way, uniformed staff, they're like law enforcement staff, said to me, I said, what's going on with him? And they said, well, he's in foster care, and he doesn't have a placement because his previous placement doesn't want him back. And he's supposed to be released in a week. And we haven't heard anything from the agency about where he's supposed to go in a week, and he's freaking out. And so they had like illegally brought their cell phones into the staff brought their cell phones to the facility and were Googling teenage independent transitional living programs. And I felt for everyone there because, you know, the staff didn't know anything about transitional living. Like, God bless them, you know, like it was great they were trying to do it, but they don't know anything. And they don't know the complexity of his legal status and his age and all those things. But they were so desperate because they felt the state was doing nothing to care for this kid. And then the kid was completely paralyzed by despair and worry about his release. And to me, that was a very common story. I mean, I so often saw staff filling out FAFSA forms or desperately trying to find somewhere for someone to live, or, you know, and because in part, like, the failure of the state was a failure of imagination to recognize, like, they only would see reentry in terms of reporting rather than in terms of someone's life, you know, and how they pursue it. One more question?
When these kids are released out into their probation officers, the reentry program, they don't come to these guys until like different programs, like miracle programs, like school programs, or so they can better themselves and they can.
Yeah, like, I think this is improved. So when I was working in the system, when they were released onto adult level parole, no. And this is in New York, mainly in New York City and across upstate New York. But then aftercare began to improve, so they started contracting with some programs and services and some mentoring programs. But remember also, New York State is so huge. It's kind of like Pennsylvania. Like, you know, Philadelphia is really resource rich in a lot of ways. So you got some programs here. But for a lot of young people who come from Buffalo and Syracuse and Rochester and Troy and Utica, you know, there aren't any programs that, and I was struck by that when I moved to upstate New York. I moved near Poughkeepsie, and I worked on some cases in Poughkeepsie, and there were no alternative to incarceration programs for teenagers there. So, you know, whatever exists is whatever, you know, the state will be able to arrange. So, thank you all so much.